Iran before Islam. The history of ancient Persia. Before the rise of Islam, the land known today as Iran carried one of the oldest and most powerful civilizations in human history. This region was called Persia by the Greeks and later by the Western world, but its own people called it Iranshar, the land of the Aryans. Its history stretches back thousands of years before recorded empires into prehistoric cultures that shaped the foundations of governance, writing, religion, and imperial rule. The earliest known civilizations in the Iranian plateau began forming around 10,000 years ago, when small communities transitioned from nomadic life to settled agricultural societies. Archaeological discoveries in regions such as Susa and the Zagros Mountains show that early Iranians developed farming techniques, domesticated animals, and built permanent settlements long before the rise of Mesopotamian empires fully expanded eastward. These early societies did not yet form unified kingdoms, but they laid the cultural and technological foundation for later civilizations. By around 3000 BCE, the southwestern region of Iran became home to one of the earliest advanced civilizations, Elam. The Elamite civilization, centered in the city of Susa, became a major political and cultural force in the ancient Near East. Elam developed its own writing system known as Proto-Elamite script, which remains partially undeciphered today. This civilization interacted constantly with neighboring Mesopotamian powers such as Sumer, Akkad, and Babylon, sometimes as allies and sometimes as rivals. Elam survived for thousands of years, making it one of the longest-lasting civilizations in ancient history. While Elam flourished in the southwest, other regions of the Iranian plateau were inhabited by Indo-Iranian tribes. These tribes were part of a larger Indo-European migration that moved across Eurasia. Over time, they divided into groups, with some moving into the Indian subcontinent and others settling in the Iranian plateau. These groups would eventually become the Medes, Persians, Parthians, and other Iranian peoples who shaped the classical era of Persian history. The transformation from tribal societies to organized states began during the early first millennium BCE. Among the most important of these groups were the Medes, who established one of the first Iranian kingdoms in northwestern Iran. The Medes unified various tribes under a centralized authority and created a political structure that later influenced the rise of the Persian Empire. Their capital, Ecbatana, became a center of power and administration. During this same period, another group known as the Persians settled in the region of Fars in southwestern Iran. These Persians were initially under the dominance of the more powerful Assyrian Empire, which controlled much of the Near East through military force. The Assyrians were known for their powerful army, advanced weaponry, and strict imperial administration. However, their control over the Iranian plateau was always challenged by local tribes and emerging kingdoms. The Medes eventually played a crucial role in the downfall of the Assyrian Empire. In alliance with the Babylonians, the Medes participated in the destruction of Nineveh in 612 BCE, marking the end of Assyrian dominance. This victory reshaped the balance of power in the ancient world and opened the path for the rise of new empires in the region. After the fall of Assyria, the Medes became one of the dominant powers in Iran and parts of Anatolia. However, their rule was relatively short-lived in comparison to what came next. Within a few decades, a new leader would rise from the Persian tribes and Fars, changing world history forever. This leader was Cyrus the Great. Cyrus belonged to the Achaemenid dynasty, a noble Persian family that traced its origins to the early Persian tribal structure. Around 550 BCE, Cyrus led a rebellion against the Median king Astyages. Surprisingly, instead of simply destroying the Median system, Cyrus unified the Medes and Persians under a single rule. This moment marked the beginning of the Achaemenid Empire, the first great Persian empire and one of the largest empires the ancient world had ever seen. Cyrus the Great is remembered not only for conquest but also for his approach to governance. Unlike many ancient rulers who relied purely on destruction and fear, Cyrus established a system of tolerance and administrative organization. He allowed conquered peoples to maintain their customs, religions, and local governance as long as they remained loyal to the empire. This policy helped stabilize a vast and diverse territory stretching from the Indus Valley to Anatolia. One of Cyrus's most famous achievements was the conquest of Babylon in 539 BCE. Instead of destroying the city, Cyrus entered peacefully and was welcomed by many Babylonians who viewed him as a liberator from oppressive rule. This event was recorded in the famous Cyrus Cylinder, which is often considered one of the earliest declarations of human rights, emphasizing religious tolerance and humane governance. Under Cyrus, the foundations of the Persian imperial system were established. The empire was divided into provinces called satrapies, each governed by a satrap, who acted as the king's representative. This system allowed efficient administration across vast distances and influenced later imperial systems in both the ancient and modern world. As Cyrus expanded the empire, he laid the groundwork for what would become a golden age of Persian power. However, his death marked the beginning of new challenges. His successors would continue expansion, but also face resistance from emerging powers such as Greece. At this stage in history, Iran was no longer a collection of tribes or regional kingdoms. It had become the center of one of the most sophisticated and powerful empires in human history. After the death of Cyrus the Great, the Achaemenid Empire did not collapse. Instead, it entered a new phase of consolidation, expansion, and administrative perfection. The empire passed to his son, Cambyses II, who continued the expansionist vision of Persia, pushing the boundaries of imperial control further into Egypt and North Africa. Cambyses II is most famously known for the conquest of Egypt in 525 BCE. With this campaign, Egypt, one of the world's oldest and most culturally advanced civilizations, fell under Persian rule. The Persian Empire now stretched across three major ancient civilizations: Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Iranian plateau. This made it the largest empire the world had seen up to that point in history. However, Cambyses' reign was short and politically unstable. After his death, a period of uncertainty followed within the empire. Various accounts describe internal power struggles, and it was during this time that Darius I, later known as Darius the Great, rose to power. Darius I was not a direct heir of Cyrus, but he claimed legitimacy through royal lineage and political authority. His rise involved securing control over competing factions within the empire and restoring order after a brief period of instability. Once he established control, Darius transformed the Persian Empire into a highly organized and efficient imperial system that would define its strength for generations. Under Darius the Great, the Achaemenid Empire reached its peak in terms of structure, governance, and economic integration. One of his most important contributions was the formalization of the satrapy system. Although Cyrus had introduced the idea, Darius refined it into a strict administrative framework. The empire was divided into provinces, each governed by a satrap, but these governors were closely monitored by royal inspectors known as the king's eyes and ears. This ensured that no regional governor could become too powerful or rebellious. Darius also introduced standardized taxation across the empire. Instead of arbitrary tribute, each region contributed based on its resources and productivity. This created a stable flow of wealth into the imperial treasury, allowing the empire to fund massive infrastructure projects, military campaigns, and administrative development. One of Darius's most remarkable achievements was the construction of the Royal Road. This vast network of roads stretched over 2,500 kilometers, connecting Sardis in Anatolia to Susa in Iran. Along this road, courier stations were established so that messages could be transmitted rapidly across the empire. Royal messengers could travel the entire length of the empire in just days using a relay system of horses. This communication network was one of the most advanced of its time, and later inspired imperial communication systems in other civilizations. Darius also focused heavily on architecture and symbolism. He built a new ceremonial capital at Persepolis, a city designed not just for administration, but also to display the grandeur of Persian imperial power. Massive stone columns, intricate carvings, and grand staircases depicted delegations from across the empire bringing tribute to the Persian king. Persepolis was not merely a city. It was a visual representation of imperial unity and diversity under Persian rule. Religiously and culturally, this period also saw the increasing influence of Zoroastrianism, although scholars still debate how formally it was adopted by the Achaemenid rulers. Its ideas of truth, order, and cosmic dualism influenced royal ideology. The concept of Asha, truth and righteousness, became associated with legitimate kingship, and Persian rulers often portrayed themselves as protectors of cosmic order against chaos and deception. Despite internal reforms, the empire faced external challenges. The most significant came from the west, the Greek city-states. Persia's expansion into Asia Minor brought it into direct contact with Greek civilization. tensions escalated as Persian governors in Anatolia controlled Greek cities, leading to resistance and rebellion. These conflicts eventually escalated into what would be known as the Greco-Persian Wars. The first major uprising began in Ionia, where Greek cities under Persian control rebelled against imperial rule. Darius responded with military force, reasserting control and punishing rebellious cities. However, these conflicts would not end with him. They would continue into the reign of his son, Xerxes I. Even as wars loomed on the western frontier, the Persian Empire under Darius remained incredibly advanced compared to other civilizations of its time. Its administrative efficiency, cultural tolerance, infrastructure, and economic integration created a model of imperial governance that influenced future empires, including the Roman Empire, centuries later. Darius the Great is often remembered not only as a conqueror, but as an organizer of civilization. He transformed a vast collection of territories into a structured imperial system that functioned through law, communication, and administrative order rather than constant military control. By the end of his reign, the Achaemenid Empire had reached its greatest territorial extent so far, stretching from the Indus Valley in the east to the edges of Greece in the west, and from Central Asia down to Egypt and the Arabian deserts. Yet beneath this immense power, new tensions were forming, tensions that would lead to one of the most famous clashes in ancient history between Persia and Greece. This marked the beginning of a new phase in Iranian history, where imperial strength would be tested by foreign resistance and internal complexity. After the long and transformative reign of Darius the Great, the Persian Empire entered a new era under his son, Xerxes I. By this time, the Achaemenid Empire was at its peak in size, wealth, and administrative strength, stretching across 3 continents and ruling over millions of people from diverse cultures, languages, and religions. Xerxes I inherited not only a vast empire, but also unfinished conflicts with the Greek city-states. These tensions had begun during Darius's reign, but now escalated into one of the most famous military confrontations in ancient history, the Greco-Persian Wars at their greatest intensity. Xerxes initially focused on consolidating internal control. The empire was too large to rely only on force, so imperial unity depended on loyalty, communication, and the satrap system established by Darius. However, the western frontier remained unstable. Greek cities had previously resisted Persian rule, and Athens in particular had supported rebellions in Ionia. This created a strong motivation for Xerxes to launch a massive military campaign to assert Persian dominance over Greece. To prepare for this invasion, Xerxes assembled one of the largest armies the ancient world had ever seen. Ancient sources describe enormous numbers, though modern historians debate the exact scale. Regardless of exaggeration, it is clear that Xerxes mobilized forces from across the empire: Persians, Medes, Egyptians, Babylonians, Indians, and many other subject peoples, forming a truly multinational imperial army. Alongside this land force, a powerful naval fleet was also constructed, drawing ships from Phoenicia, Egypt, and coastal regions of the empire. The campaign into Greece began with confidence and overwhelming force. Persian forces advanced through Thrace and Macedonia with little resistance, demonstrating the empire's logistical power and military reach. However, as the Persian army moved deeper into the narrow terrain of Greece, the nature of warfare began to change. One of the most famous moments in this conflict occurred at the narrow pass of Thermopylae. Here, a small Greek force led by King Leonidas of Sparta attempted to block the Persian advance. The geographical constraints of the pass reduced the advantage of Persia's large army. For several days, fierce fighting took place. Eventually, through a strategic maneuver that bypassed the Greek defensive position, the Persians broke through. The battle became legendary, not because of its outcome alone, but because it symbolized the clash between a vast empire and a determined smaller force. After Thermopylae, Persian forces moved into central Greece. Athens was eventually captured and partially destroyed, but the conflict was far from over. The decisive turning point came at sea in the Battle of Salamis. Here, the Greek navy, using smaller and more agile ships, lured the larger Persian fleet into narrow waters where maneuverability became difficult. The result was a devastating defeat for the Persian naval forces. The loss at Salamis changed the strategic balance of the war. Without naval dominance, supplying and controlling the Greek mainland became extremely difficult for Persia. Although Xerxes attempted to continue the campaign, he eventually withdrew much of his forces, leaving behind a portion of the army under his generals. The following year, Persian land forces also suffered a major defeat at Plataea, marking the end of the major Persian invasion of Greece. Despite these setbacks, the Persian Empire did not collapse. Its internal structure remained strong, and its vast territories across Asia, Africa, and the Near East continued to function under imperial administration. However, the psychological impact of the Greek wars was significant. For the Greeks, these battles became foundational myths of resistance and identity. For Persia, they marked the limits of expansion towards the West. After the military campaigns, Xerxes shifted his focus back to internal governance and monumental construction. Persepolis continued to develop as a ceremonial capital, symbolizing imperial unity. The city became a center for royal ceremonies, tribute receptions, and administrative symbolism, reinforcing the idea of the Persian king as the ruler of a global order. However, Xerxes' later reign was marked by increasing internal challenges. Maintaining control over such a vast empire required constant attention to regional governors, court politics, and economic stability. Over time, court intrigue became more prominent, and royal authority faced pressures from within the imperial system itself. Xerxes was eventually assassinated, marking another turning point in Achaemenid history. After his death, the empire entered a phase where rulers were less dominant than Cyrus, Darius, or Xerxes. While the imperial structure remained intact, internal stability began to slowly weaken over generations. Yet even during this period, the Achaemenid Empire remained one of the most powerful political systems in the world. Its administration, cultural diversity, communication networks, and economic integration continued to function across vast distances, influencing later empires in both the East and West. The legacy of this era was not only in warfare, but in governance. Persia demonstrated that a large empire could be managed through systems of law, administration, and tolerance rather than constant destruction. This model would echo through later civilizations for centuries. As the Achaemenid Empire moved beyond Xerxes' reign, new challenges were already forming, both from internal political changes and from a rising power in the West that would eventually reshape the entire ancient world. After the era of Xerxes I, the Achaemenid Empire continued to exist as a vast and complex political system, but its internal dynamics began to slowly change. The empire was still powerful, still wealthy, and still one of the most influential forces in the ancient world. Yet the nature of its leadership became less stable compared to the early foundational reigns of Cyrus the Great and Darius the Great. In the generations following Xerxes, a series of kings ruled the empire, including Artaxerxes I, Darius II, and Artaxerxes II. These rulers inherited a system that was already extremely large and administratively heavy. Governing such a wide territory required strong central authority, but over time royal power became more dependent on court politics, regional governors, and palace influence. During this period, the satrap system remained the backbone of the empire. Each province was still governed by a satrap, who collected taxes, maintained order, and reported to the central administration. However, as time passed, some satraps began to accumulate significant local power. In distant provinces, loyalty to the central Persian authority sometimes weakened, especially when communication across the empire became slower and political oversight less direct. Despite these challenges, the Achaemenid Empire remained culturally and economically diverse. Trade routes continued to connect regions from India to Egypt and from Central Asia to Anatolia. Cities like Susa, Persepolis, and Babylon remained important administrative and cultural centers. The royal road system still functioned as a vital communication network, allowing imperial messages and goods to travel across enormous distances. Religiously and culturally, this period also saw continued development of Iranian traditions. Zoroastrian ideas remained influential, particularly the concepts of truth, order, and the struggle between good and chaos. However, the empire itself was religiously tolerant, and many local belief systems continued to exist side by side under Persian rule. Even as internal stability gradually weakened in some areas, the empire did not show immediate signs of collapse. Instead, it entered a long phase of slow structural strain. Royal succession disputes occasionally created instability at the center, and court politics sometimes overshadowed effective governance. In some cases, influential nobles and court officials held more practical power than the king himself. At the same time, a new force was rising in the West that would eventually challenge the entire Persian imperial system. This force came from Macedonia, a kingdom in northern Greece that had slowly been gaining strength under its own ambitious leadership. By the time of King Artaxerxes III, the Persian Empire was still capable of projecting immense power. Artaxerxes III managed to reassert control over rebellious regions and restore some level of imperial strength. His reign briefly stabilized the empire and demonstrated that Achaemenid authority was still formidable when properly centralized. However, after his assassination, the empire once again entered a period of instability. Short reigns, internal conflicts, and succession struggles weakened central authority. It was during this vulnerable phase that Macedonia, under King Philip II, and later his son Alexander, began to expand aggressively. Philip II of Macedonia reorganized his army, introduced new military tactics, and unified Greek city-states under Macedonian leadership. After his assassination, his son Alexander III, later known as Alexander the Great, inherited both a powerful army and a clear ambition to challenge the Persian Empire itself. When Alexander launched his campaign against Persia in 334 BCE, the Achaemenid Empire was still massive in size but increasingly vulnerable in coordination. The Persian response was large in scale, but less unified than in earlier centuries. Regional commanders often acted independently, and coordination between different parts of the empire was inconsistent. The first major confrontation between Alexander and Persia occurred at the Battle of Granicus. Persian forces attempted to stop the Macedonian advance in Asia Minor but were defeated. This marked the beginning of a rapid sequence of military losses for the Persian side. Following Granicus, Alexander advanced deeper into Persian territory and met Darius III, the last Achaemenid emperor, at the Battle of Issus. Despite commanding a large army, Darius III was forced to retreat after a decisive Macedonian victory. This defeat had a major psychological impact on the empire, as it demonstrated that the Persian military system, once the most powerful in the world, was now vulnerable to a highly mobile and strategically innovative enemy. Alexander continued his campaign southward, capturing Phoenician cities and eventually moving into Egypt, where he was welcomed as a liberator. Meanwhile, Darius III attempted to regroup and prepare a final resistance. The decisive confrontation came at the Battle of Gaugamela in 331 BCE. Here, Darius III assembled a vast army drawn from across the remaining empire. The battlefield was chosen carefully to allow Persian numerical advantage, but Alexander's tactical brilliance and disciplined forces overcame the Persian strategy. The result was a catastrophic defeat for the Achaemenid Empire. After Gaugamela, the political structure of the empire effectively collapsed. Darius III fled eastward, attempting to escape and reorganize resistance. But he was eventually betrayed and killed by one of his own satraps. With his death, the Achaemenid dynasty came to an end after more than 2 centuries of rule. Alexander then entered Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis. The heart of the Persian imperial system fell under Macedonian control. Persepolis, once a symbol of imperial unity and grandeur, was famously burned during this period, marking both a physical and symbolic end to the Achaemenid Empire. However, even though the empire fell, its influence did not disappear. Persian administrative systems, cultural traditions, and governance models continued to influence later empires, including those that would rise in Iran itself after Alexander's death. The fall of the Achaemenid Empire marked the end of one of the greatest imperial systems in ancient history. But it did not mark the end of Iranian civilization. Instead, it opened a new chapter in which foreign rule, cultural blending, and new dynasties would reshape the region in unexpected ways. After the collapse of the Achaemenid Empire under Darius III, the entry of Alexander the Great into the heart of Persia marked a turning point not only in Iranian history but in the entire ancient world. What followed was not simply conquest, but a deep transformation of political structure, culture, and identity across the Iranian plateau and beyond. Alexander moved rapidly to the former imperial capitals of Persia, Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis, centers that had symbolized centuries of Achaemenid authority, were brought under Macedonian control. The administrative machinery of the Persian Empire, although broken at the highest level, still existed in many regions, and Alexander utilized much of it rather than dismantling everything. Persian scribes, tax systems, and provincial structures were partially preserved because they were too efficient and deeply rooted to be fully replaced. One of the most symbolic moments of this transition occurred in Persepolis. The city, once the ceremonial heart of the Achaemenid world, was set ablaze. Ancient accounts suggest different motivations. Some describe it as revenge for earlier Persian actions in Greece, while others interpret it as a political statement marking the end of the Achaemenid legacy. Whatever the exact reason, the destruction of Persepolis became a defining symbol of the end of an era. After consolidating control over Persia, Alexander began to envision a new kind of empire, one that merged Greek and Eastern cultures into a unified system. This idea is often referred to as cultural fusion or Hellenization. He encouraged the blending of Macedonian Greek and Persian elites, promoted intermarriage between cultures, and adopted certain elements of Persian royal customs himself. In doing so, Alexander attempted to bridge the divide between conqueror and conquered, ruler and subject. However, this vision remained incomplete. Alexander's sudden death in 323 BCE left his vast empire without a stable successor. With no clear heir capable of controlling such a massive territory, his generals, known as the Diadochi, divided the empire among themselves. This division marked the beginning of the Hellenistic period in the Near East. In the territory of former Persia, one of the most important successor states to emerge was the Seleucid Empire. Founded by Seleucus, the first Nicator, this empire controlled much of Iran, Mesopotamia, and surrounding regions. The Seleucids attempted to maintain Greek-style governance while ruling over a predominantly non-Greek population. Cities were founded or reorganized with Greek institutions, and Greek became the language of administration in many areas. However, the Iranian plateau was not a passive region under Seleucid rule. Local traditions, noble families, and regional identities remained strong. Over time, resistance to foreign Hellenistic control began to grow. Persian cultural identity did not disappear. Instead, it adapted and persisted beneath the surface of political change. In rural areas and among Iranian noble families, older traditions linked to pre-Achaemenid and Achaemenid heritage continued. Religious practices influenced by Zoroastrian thought remained present, and the memory of Persian imperial greatness persisted as a powerful cultural force. This continuity would later become extremely important in shaping future Iranian dynasties. As Seleucid control stretched across vast territories, maintaining unity became increasingly difficult. The empire was stretched between east and west, and local governors often operated with significant autonomy. In Iran, this weakness became more visible over time. Local leaders and emerging Iranian aristocratic families began to assert greater independence, especially in the eastern regions. One of the most significant developments during this period was the rise of Parthian power in northeastern Iran. The Parthians were an Iranian people who originally lived in the region of Parthava. They began as a minor regional force, but over time, they grew stronger by taking advantage of Seleucid weaknesses. Their society was heavily influenced by both Iranian traditions and some Hellenistic elements, creating a unique cultural blend. The Parthians developed a decentralized political system where local noble families held significant power under a loose central authority. This system contrasted with the highly centralized Achaemenid structure, but it was well suited to the geography and political realities of the region at the time. As Seleucid authority weakened further, the Parthians gradually expanded their influence across Iran. They reclaimed territories that had once been part of the Achaemenid Empire and positioned themselves as heirs to Persian imperial tradition even while ruling in a different style. By the end of the Seleucid period in Iran, the cultural landscape of the region had become layered and complex. Greek, Iranian, and local traditions coexisted, sometimes blending and sometimes competing. While political control had shifted multiple times since the fall of the Achaemenids, the underlying identity of the region remained deeply Iranian in its historical memory and cultural continuity. This period of Hellenistic rule did not erase Persia's past. Instead, it created the conditions for a new resurgence of Iranian power, one that would eventually challenge and replace Seleucid authority, restoring Iranian-led rule in the region. That resurgence would come through the rise of the Parthian Empire, which would once again place Iran at the center of a major imperial system. After the weakening of Seleucid authority in Iran, a major shift began to take shape across the eastern provinces. Iranian identity, which had never disappeared despite Greek political dominance, began to reassert itself in a powerful and organized form. This resurgence came through the rise of the Parthians, also known as the Arsacid dynasty, one of the most important Iranian empires before the arrival of Islam. The Parthians originally emerged from the region of Parthava in northeastern Iran. They were an Iranian-speaking people who maintained strong connections to nomadic and semi-nomadic traditions. Unlike the centralized structure of the Achaemenids, the Parthians developed a more flexible and aristocratic system of governance, where powerful noble families played a major role in administration and military organization. The foundation of Parthian power is usually associated with Arsaces I, who led a successful revolt against Seleucid control around the mid-3rd century BCE. This marked the beginning of the Arsacid dynasty. Over time, the Parthians expanded from a small regional force into a dominant power across much of Iran and Mesopotamia. As Seleucid authority continued to decline due to internal instability and external pressures, the Parthians steadily captured key territories. They gradually took control of important trade routes and strategic cities, strengthening both their economic and military position. By combining mobility, cavalry-based warfare, and local alliances, they built a system capable of challenging even the strongest enemies. One of the defining features of the Parthian military system was its heavy reliance on cavalry, especially horse archers. Parthian warriors became famous for their ability to fight while mounted, using hit-and-run tactics that confused and exhausted enemy forces. This style of warfare would later become legendary in conflicts against Rome. As the Parthian Empire expanded westward, it came into direct contact with the rising power of Rome. This marked the beginning of one of the most important rivalries in ancient history: Rome versus Parthia. Unlike earlier conflicts between Persia and Greece, this new struggle was between two mature imperial systems, both highly organized and militarily advanced. The first major confrontation between Rome and Parthia occurred in the 1st century BCE, most famously at the Battle of Carrhae in 53 BCE. In this battle, the Roman general Crassus led a large army into Mesopotamia, expecting an easy victory. However, the Parthian cavalry, using superior mobility and long-range archery, surrounded and destroyed the Roman forces. The defeat was catastrophic for Rome and demonstrated the military strength of the Parthian system. The Parthians did not rely on centralized bureaucracy in the same way as the Achaemenids. Instead, their empire functioned as a network of semi-independent kingdoms and noble families under the authority of the Arsacid king. This system allowed flexibility, but also created internal challenges, as regional rulers sometimes acted independently or resisted central control. Despite this decentralized structure, the Parthians maintained control over vast territories for centuries. Their empire stretched from the Euphrates River in the west to the eastern Iranian regions and beyond. They controlled major trade routes, connecting the Roman world with Central Asia and China, making their empire an essential link in the ancient Silk Road network. Culturally, the Parthian period was one of blending and continuity. Greek influences from the Hellenistic period did not disappear completely, but they were gradually absorbed into Iranian traditions. Local languages, customs, and religious practices continued to thrive. Zoroastrian ideas remained influential, although not always in a centralized or uniform form. The Parthian aristocracy placed great importance on honor, lineage, and tribal identity. These values shaped both political relationships and military organization. Loyalty was often based on personal and family connections rather than strict institutional structures. Over time, however, internal weaknesses began to appear. The decentralized nature of Parthian rule sometimes led to disputes between noble families and conflicts over succession. At the same time, Rome continued to grow stronger in the West, repeatedly attempting to expand its influence into Mesopotamia and beyond. Despite these challenges, the Parthians successfully resisted Roman expansion for centuries. They preserved Iranian political identity during a time when external pressure from powerful empires could have erased it entirely. Their ability to maintain independence in the face of Rome's rise demonstrated the resilience of Iranian civilization. By the early centuries CE, however, new forces were emerging within Iran itself. Local dynasties and powerful noble families began to challenge Parthian authority. Among these internal powers, one region in particular, Persepolis, the original homeland of the ancient Persians, would become the center of a new political transformation. This region would give rise to a dynasty that would replace the Parthians and restore a more centralized form of Iranian imperial rule. That dynasty would become known as the Sassanids, and they would mark the final great imperial era of Iran before the arrival of Islam. This transition set the stage for another major transformation in Iranian history, one that would reshape religion, politics, and culture across the region once again. As Parthian authority gradually weakened due to internal rivalries and decentralized rule, a new power began to rise from the heartland of ancient Persia itself. This region, known as Perses or Fairs, had once been the birthplace of the Achaemenid Empire. Now it became the center of a renewed Iranian imperial vision that would reshape the political and religious structure of the entire region. This transformation was led by Ardashir I, a local ruler who served under the Parthian vassal system but steadily built his own power base. Ardashir belonged to the house of Sassan, from which the Sassanid Empire takes its name. Through military skill, political strategy, and alliances with local Iranian nobles, he challenged Parthian authority and gradually expanded his control over neighboring territories. The final confrontation between Ardashir and the Parthian king Artabanus IV marked the end of the Arsacid dynasty. Around 224 CE, Ardashir defeated the Parthian forces and established himself as the ruler of a new centralized empire. This event is widely considered the foundation of the Sassanid Empire, which would become the last great pre-Islamic Iranian empire. Unlike the Parthian system, which was based on a loose federation of noble families, the Sassanid Empire was highly centralized. Ardashir I aimed to restore the imperial structure of earlier Persian empires, particularly the Achaemenid model of strong royal authority. The king was not only a political ruler but also a sacred figure, seen as the representative of divine order on earth. One of the most important features of the Sassanid state was its close relationship with Zoroastrianism, Under Sassanid rule, Zoroastrianism became the official state religion. The clergy, known as the Magi, gained significant influence in both political and social life. Fire temples were established across the empire, and religious doctrine became closely linked with royal authority. The Sassanids promoted the idea of Kavarana, or divine royal glory, which justified the legitimacy of the king. According to this belief, the right to rule was granted by divine favor, and maintaining justice and order was seen as a sacred duty of the monarchy. After Ardashir I, his son Shapur I continued the expansion and consolidation of the empire. Shapur I is known for his military campaigns against the Roman Empire, during which he achieved significant victories and even captured a Roman emperor, Valerian, in battle. This was one of the most humiliating defeats in Roman history, and demonstrated the strength of the Sassanid military system. The Sassanid military was highly organized, with a strong emphasis on heavy cavalry, known as the cataphracts. These armored horsemen were supported by infantry units and siege capabilities, making the Sassanid army one of the most advanced military forces of its time. The empire's strategic location also allowed it to control major trade routes connecting east and west. Throughout its history, the Sassanid Empire maintained continuous conflict and competition with the Roman Empire and later the Byzantine Empire. These wars were not just military struggles, but also ideological and economic rivalries between two powerful imperial systems. Border regions frequently changed hands, and long periods of warfare shaped the political landscape of the Near East. Despite constant military pressure, the Sassanid Empire developed a highly sophisticated administrative system. Provinces were governed by appointed officials, taxation was systematically organized, and major cities like Ctesiphon became centers of political and economic activity. The capital region along the Tigris River grew into one of the most important urban centers of the ancient world. Culturally, the Sassanid period is considered one of the great achievements of Iranian civilization. Art, architecture, literature, and science flourished under royal patronage. Elaborate rock reliefs depicted royal victories and divine legitimacy, while architecture showcased grand palaces and fire temples. The empire also played a crucial role in preserving and transmitting knowledge. Greek philosophical and scientific texts were translated into Middle Persian, and intellectual exchanges occurred across borders with India, Rome, and Central Asia. This cultural interaction helped shape intellectual traditions that would later influence the Islamic Golden Age. However, despite its strength and sophistication, the Sassanid Empire also faced internal challenges. Succession disputes, noble rivalries, and religious tensions occasionally weakened central authority. Over time, prolonged wars with Byzantium drained resources and strained the empire's stability. By the early 7th century, the Sassanid Empire had reached both a cultural peak and a state of exhaustion. Continuous warfare and political instability created vulnerabilities that would soon be exploited by a new emerging force from the Arabian Peninsula. This marked the beginning of the final chapter of pre-Islamic Iranian history. a new religious and political transformation was approaching, one that would permanently change the identity of the region and bring the long era of ancient Persian empires to an end. By the early 7th century CE, the Sassanid Empire stood as one of the two great superpowers of the known world, sharing dominance with the Byzantine Empire. Yet beneath this surface of strength, the empire was entering a period of deep exhaustion. Continuous wars, political instability, and succession struggles had weakened the central structure that once made Sassanid Iran so formidable. One of the most destructive periods in Sassanid history came during the long and devastating wars with Byzantium. Under King Khosrow II, the Sassanids initially achieved massive territorial gains. Persian forces captured key regions, including Syria, Egypt, and parts of Anatolia. At one point, the empire seemed to be approaching its greatest expansion since the time of the Achaemenids. However, this success came at a tremendous cost. The prolonged war drained the empire's treasury, exhausted its military resources, and increased internal pressure on the state. When Byzantine Emperor Heraclius launched a counteroffensive, the Sassanid forces began to collapse under sustained pressure. Major defeats followed, and territories were gradually lost. Soon after these military setbacks, internal chaos erupted within the Sassanid political system. Khosrow II was overthrown and killed, and in the years that followed, the empire experienced rapid changes of rulers. Kings came and went in quick succession, often lasting only months or even weeks. This instability severely weakened central authority and disrupted governance across the empire. Regional governors, noble families, and military commanders began acting independently. The unity of the Sassanid state, once carefully maintained through strong royal authority and Zoroastrian state ideology, began to fracture. Economic instability and weakened control over provinces further accelerated the decline. It was during this period of internal fragmentation that a new force emerged from the Arabian Peninsula. This force was not initially recognized as a major imperial threat by the established powers of the region. However, it would soon reshape the entire political landscape of the Near East. Following the death of the Prophet Muhammad in 632 CE, the early Islamic state rapidly expanded under the leadership of the Rashidun caliphs. Unified by religious belief and strong military organization, Arab forces began campaigns beyond the Arabian Peninsula. Their expansion initially targeted the weakening Byzantine and Sassanid frontiers. The Sassanid Empire, already weakened by internal conflict, was unprepared for the speed and coordination of these new military campaigns. Early encounters between Sassanid forces and Arab armies demonstrated that the balance of power in the region was shifting rapidly. One of the most decisive moments came at the Battle of Al-Qadisiyah around 636 CE. Here, Sassanid forces led by experienced commanders attempted to halt the advance of the Arab armies. However, despite their traditional military strength and armored cavalry, the Sassanids were defeated. This battle opened the path to the heart of Mesopotamia. Following this defeat, key cities of the empire began to fall. Ctesiphon, the magnificent capital of the Sassanid Empire, located on the Tigris River, was captured. The loss of the capital was a major symbolic and administrative blow. It marked the beginning of the irreversible collapse of central Sassanid authority. Despite continued resistance in various regions, including eastern Iran, the empire was no longer able to function as a unified state. Successive defeats and internal fragmentation prevented any successful long-term recovery. The last Sassanid king, Yazdegerd III, attempted to regroup forces in the eastern provinces, but he faced continuous pressure from advancing Arab armies and internal instability. By 651 CE, Yazdegerd III was killed, marking the formal end of the Sassanid Empire. With his death, over 1,000 years of continuous pre-Islamic Iranian imperial history came to a close. The ancient political structures of Persia, developed through the Achaemenid, Parthian, and Sassanid periods, were replaced by a new political and religious order. However, the end of the Sassanid Empire did not mean the end of Iranian civilization. Instead, it marked a profound transformation. Many aspects of Persian administration, culture, language, and intellectual tradition continued under the new Islamic governance. Persian scribes, bureaucratic systems, and cultural practices played a major role in shaping the emerging Islamic world. Over time, Persian identity reasserted itself within the Islamic civilization, particularly through the development of Persian literature, science, and administration in later centuries. The legacy of ancient Iran did not disappear. It evolved and became integrated into a new historical framework. Thus, the fall of the Sassanid Empire represents not only the end of pre-Islamic Iran, but also the beginning of a new era in which Iranian heritage continued to influence regional and global history in profound ways. With the fall of the Sassanid Empire in 651 CE, a long and continuous era of ancient Iranian imperial history came to an end. Yet history in this region did not end. It transformed. The political structures of the Achaemenids, Parthians, and Sassanids disappeared, but the cultural, administrative, and intellectual foundations built over more than a millennium did not vanish. Instead, they adapted and continued within a new civilizational framework. One of the most important aspects of Iranian continuity after the Islamic conquest was administration. The early Islamic caliphates, particularly the Umayyads and Abbasids, relied heavily on Persian bureaucrats and scribes. The Sassanid administrative model, including taxation systems, provincial governance, and record-keeping, influenced the structure of the new Islamic state. In many regions, former Sassanid officials continued their roles under new leadership, ensuring continuity in governance. The Persian language itself also survived and eventually re-emerged strongly. Although Arabic became the language of religion and formal state affairs in the early Islamic period, Persian gradually reasserted itself, especially in literature and court culture. By the 9th and 10th century CE, New Persian, written in Arabic script, became one of the major literary languages of the Islamic world. This revival ensured that Iranian cultural identity remained strong despite political change. Cultural memory of the ancient Persian empires also remained deeply rooted in Iranian society. Stories of Cyrus, Darius, and ancient kings were preserved in oral traditions and later recorded in historical and literary works. The concept of kingship, justice, and imperial order continued to influence political thought in the region long after the ancient empires had disappeared. Religious transformation was another major change during this period. Zoroastrianism, once the dominant state religion of the Sassanid Empire, gradually declined in political influence. However, it did not completely disappear. Small communities continued to practice it, and its philosophical ideas, particularly concepts of truth, duality, and cosmic order, continued to influence later religious and cultural thought in subtle ways. At the same time, Iran became an important center of Islamic civilization. Cities such as Baghdad, Nishapur, Isfahan, and Ray grew into major hubs of learning, science, philosophy, and literature. Many of the most influential scholars, scientists, and poets of the Islamic Golden Age were of Persian origin. This included contributions in mathematics, medicine, astronomy, philosophy, and poetry. In this way, Iranian civilization did not end with the fall of its ancient empires. It transformed into a new phase of cultural and intellectual influence that extended far beyond its original political borders. The legacy of ancient Persia continued through institutions, language, literature, and ideas that shaped the broader Islamic world. Looking back across more than 1,000 years of history, from early Elamite civilization to the Sassanid Empire, Iran before Islam represents one of the most continuous and influential cultural trajectories in human history. It produced some of the earliest models of empire, governance, infrastructure, and cultural integration. The Achaemenids introduced large-scale imperial administration and tolerance across diverse populations. The Parthians preserved Iranian identity during centuries of foreign pressure and maintained strategic resistance against Rome. The Sassanids revived centralized Persian authority, strengthened cultural identity, and contributed significantly to science, art, and statecraft. Together, these civilizations formed a continuous historical foundation that deeply shaped the development of the Near East and influenced later world history in both East and West. Even after the political structures of ancient Persia disappeared, its legacy remained embedded in the cultural and historical consciousness of the region. Iran's ancient past became part of a larger story of adaptation, survival, and transformation. In conclusion, the history of Iran before Islam is not only a record of empires and kings, but also a story of continuity through change. It is the story of how a civilization can fall politically, yet survive culturally, reshaping itself across centuries while still preserving its identity. After the major political transformations of ancient Iran, from the rise of Elam to the fall of the Sassanids, the deeper story of Persia is not only about empires, but about long-term continuity beneath imperial change. Even when dynasties ended, many structures of Iranian civilization remained embedded in society. One of the most important long-term continuities was the idea of kingship itself. Across Achaemenid, Parthian, and Sassanid periods, kingship in Iran was never just political authority. It was deeply tied to divine legitimacy, justice, and cosmic order. The ruler was expected to maintain balance between truth and chaos, order and disorder. Even after Islamic rule replaced ancient dynasties, the cultural memory of ideal kingship continued to influence later Persian political philosophy and literature. Another deep layer of continuity was the bureaucratic tradition. Long before modern states existed, ancient Iran developed highly structured administrative systems. The Achaemenid satrapy system, refined taxation methods, and imperial communication networks created a model of governance that influenced not only later Iranian states but also neighboring civilizations. This administrative intelligence survived because it was practical, not symbolic. It was simply too effective to discard. Urban civilization in Iran also showed remarkable continuity. Cities like Susa, Ekbatana Hamadan, Persepolis, Ctesiphon, and later Nishapur and Isfahan represent a continuous chain of urban development. Even when capitals changed due to conquest or political shifts, the tradition of urban planning, trade networks, and architectural ambition remained deeply rooted in Iranian culture. Trade was another defining element of ancient Iranian civilization. Iran's geographical position made it a natural bridge between East and West. From the Silk Road routes connecting China to the Mediterranean, to the trade corridors linking India, Central Asia, and Mesopotamia, Iranian lands were always central to global commerce. This economic role ensured that even during political transitions, the region remained strategically and culturally significant. Culturally, storytelling became one of the strongest vessels of historical memory. Epic traditions, later preserved in works like the Shahnameh, carried echoes of ancient kings, heroic battles, and moral ideals from pre-Islamic Iran. These stories did not function as literal history, but as cultural memory, preserving identity through narrative rather than political institutions. Religion also shows a deeper continuity beyond institutional change. While Zoroastrianism declined after the Islamic conquest, many of its philosophical concepts, such as moral dualism, judgment, truth versus falsehood, and cosmic struggle, continued to resonate within Persian intellectual traditions in indirect forms. Cultural ideas often outlast formal religious systems, and Iran is a strong example of this process. Another important dimension is language. Even under foreign political rule at different points in history, Iranian languages persisted. Old Persian evolved into Middle Persian and later into New Persian, but the linguistic continuity remained strong. This allowed Iranian identity to survive, even when political control shifted between different empires. When viewed across millennia, ancient Iran appears not as a series of disconnected empires, but as a layered civilization. Each empire, Elamite, Median, Achaemenid, Parthian, and Sassanid, added new structures, but none erased what came before. Instead, they built upon inherited foundations, adapting them to new conditions. This is why the history of Iran before Islam is often described not simply as ancient history, but as a continuous civilizational thread. It is a story of adaptation under pressure, survival through transformation, and identity preserved through both empire and collapse. And even after the final fall of the Sassanid state, the Iranian cultural world did not disappear. It transformed again, entering a new historical phase where its influence would continue to grow in literature, science, philosophy, and statecraft across the Islamic world and beyond. Beyond empires, wars, and dynasties, ancient Iran was also a lived civilization shaped by everyday society. The strength of Persian history before Islam did not come only from kings and conquests, but from how ordinary people lived, worked, believed, and adapted across thousands of years of change. In early Iranian societies, especially during pre-Achaemenid and early Achaemenid times, life was deeply connected to land and agriculture. Most people lived in rural villages, relying on farming, irrigation systems, and seasonal cycles. The Iranian plateau, with its diverse geography of mountains, deserts, and fertile valleys, required advanced knowledge of water management. Over time, early engineering systems such as underground canals helped communities survive in dry regions, showing that innovation existed even at local levels of society. As empires developed, especially under the Achaemenids, social structure became more complex. Society was generally divided into classes, including the ruling elite, priests, warriors, scribes, merchants, and farmers. However, these divisions were not completely rigid. Mobility existed, especially through military service, trade, or administrative work. The empire's vast size meant that many different cultures and ethnic groups lived under a shared political system while maintaining their local traditions. Religion played a central role in shaping daily life. In various periods of ancient Iranian history, especially during the Sassanid era, Zoroastrianism influenced moral behavior, law, and social expectations. Concepts such as truthfulness, purity, and responsibility were not only religious ideas but also social values. Fire temples acted as centers of worship and community identity, where rituals reinforced social cohesion. Education and knowledge were also important, particularly among scribes and administrators. Writing systems evolved over time, from early Elamite scripts to cuneiform and later to Aramaic and Middle Persian forms. Literacy was generally limited to elites, but it played a crucial role in maintaining the administrative strength of empires. Royal inscriptions, tax records, and legal documents ensured that large territories could be governed efficiently. Trade and craftsmanship were essential parts of economic life. Iranian merchants operated across long-distance trade routes, connecting India, Central Asia, Mesopotamia, and the Mediterranean world. Goods such as textiles, metals, spices, and luxury items moved through these networks. Cities became centers of production, where artisans created pottery, metalwork, jewelry, and architectural decorations that reflected both local traditions and imperial styles. Women in ancient Iran held varying roles depending on time period and social class. In some eras, especially under early empires, women could own property, manage estates, and participate in economic life. Royal inscriptions and administrative records show that women in elite families sometimes held significant influence. However, as with most ancient societies, their roles were shaped by broader cultural and social structures of the time. Military life also influenced society beyond the battlefield. In the Achaemenid and Parthian periods, military service was often tied to loyalty, honor, and social status. The Parthian emphasis on cavalry warfare meant that noble families often maintained their own horse-mounted forces. This created a warrior aristocracy that played a key role in political power structures. Culturally, Iran was never isolated. Even in ancient times, it was a crossroads of civilizations. Ideas, technologies, religions, and artistic styles moved across its territory. Egyptian, Mesopotamian, Greek, Indian, and Central Asian influences all interacted within Iranian lands, creating a dynamic cultural environment. However, despite this diversity, Iranian identity remained distinct and continuous. Architecture reflected this blending of influences. From the monumental palaces of Persepolis to the fortified cities of Parthian and Sassanid times, construction styles evolved while maintaining a sense of imperial grandeur. Columns, reliefs, and palace complexes were not only functional, but also symbolic expressions of authority and identity. Over time, this combination of administration, culture, religion, and daily life created a resilient civilization. Even when political systems changed or empires fell, the underlying social fabric of Iranian society continued to function. People adapted, preserved traditions, and transmitted cultural knowledge across generations. This is why ancient Iran cannot be understood only through wars and rulers. It must also be understood as a society of farmers, merchants, soldiers, priests, scribes, and families who collectively sustained one of the longest-lasting civilizations in world history. Ancient Iran before Islam was not only a world of empires and political systems, but also a civilization that contributed deeply to knowledge, science, administration, and intellectual traditions. Across the Achaemenid, Parthian, and Sassanid periods, Iranian society developed forms of thinking and organization that influenced both the ancient and later medieval worlds. One of the earliest intellectual strengths of Iranian civilization was administration as a form of science. The Achaemenid Empire, under rulers like Darius the Great, developed highly structured systems of taxation, record-keeping, and provincial governance. While not science in the modern sense, these systems required advanced methods of calculation, logistics, and data organization across vast territories. The royal road, courier systems, and satrap administration demonstrated an early understanding of communication efficiency and state engineering. Astronomy and timekeeping also held an important place in ancient Iranian intellectual life. The observation of celestial movements was closely connected to agriculture, religion, and royal authority. In later periods, especially under the Sassanids, scholars worked to refine calendars and track astronomical cycles. These studies were not purely theoretical. They were essential for determining agricultural seasons, religious festivals, and administrative planning. Medicine in ancient Iran developed through a combination of local knowledge and cross-cultural exchange. Iranian physicians and scholars were influenced by Mesopotamian, Indian, and later Greek medical traditions. By the Sassanid period, medical knowledge had become more organized, with hospitals and training centers existing in major cities. These institutions later played an important role in preserving and transmitting medical knowledge into the Islamic era. Philosophical thought in ancient Iran was deeply connected to religion and ethics. Zoroastrianism, especially in its developed Sassanid form, introduced a structured worldview centered on the struggle between truth and falsehood, order and chaos. Concepts such as Asha truth and cosmic order shaped moral and political thinking. This ethical framework influenced not only religious life but also ideas about justice, kingship, and social responsibility. Translation and preservation of knowledge became particularly important during the late Sassanid period. Greek philosophical and scientific works were translated into Middle Persian, and Indian mathematical and astronomical ideas also entered Iranian scholarly circles. This created a multicultural intellectual environment where knowledge from different civilizations was collected, adapted, and transmitted. The Sassanid Empire is especially known for its role as a bridge of knowledge between the ancient world and the later Islamic Golden Age. When Islamic civilization expanded into Iran and Mesopotamia, many existing scholarly traditions were absorbed into the new intellectual framework. Iranian scholars, scribes, and administrators played a major role in preserving ancient texts and developing new systems of learning. Artistic expression also reflected intellectual depth. Sassanid rock reliefs, metalwork, and architecture were not just decorative. They were symbolic representations of kingship, divine authority, and cosmic order. Artistic style was often used as a political language, communicating ideas of legitimacy, power, and continuity with ancient tradition. Education in ancient Iran was generally limited to specialized groups such as scribes, priests, and administrators, but within these groups, knowledge was carefully preserved and transmitted across generations. This continuity ensured that administrative, religious, and scientific traditions did not disappear even during periods of political change. Another important intellectual legacy of ancient Iran was its approach to cultural integration. Because Iranian empires ruled over diverse populations, they developed systems that allowed multiple languages, traditions, and knowledge systems to coexist. This multicultural environment encouraged exchange rather than isolation, especially in trade cities and imperial centers. When viewed as a whole, ancient Iran's intellectual legacy was not based on a single discipline, but on a broad system of practical knowledge, administration, astronomy, medicine, ethics, and cultural synthesis. These elements combined to form a civilization that valued order, structure, and continuity across time. Even after the fall of pre-Islamic empires, this intellectual foundation did not disappear. It continued to influence later Persian contributions to science, philosophy, literature, and governance, in the centuries that followed. Thus, the history of Iran before Islam is also the history of how knowledge itself was preserved, adapted, and transmitted across one of the most important cultural regions in the ancient world. The history of Iran before Islam is one of the longest continuous civilizational stories in the ancient world, stretching from early prehistoric settlements to the collapse of the Sassanid Empire in the 7th century CE. It is not the history of a single kingdom, but a layered development of civilizations, each building upon the foundations of the previous one, creating a deep and enduring cultural identity that survived even after political systems changed. The earliest foundations of this history began with prehistoric communities on the Iranian plateau. These early societies developed agriculture, animal domestication, and settled life, gradually forming the basis for more complex civilizations. Among the earliest major civilizations was Elam, centered in southwestern Iran. Elam developed its own political structure, language, and writing system, and maintained contact and competition with Mesopotamian civilizations for thousands of years. This early period established Iran as a permanent participant in the ancient Near Eastern world. Later, Indo-Iranian tribes migrated into the region, forming the early ancestors of the Medes and Persians. These groups gradually transitioned from tribal societies into organized political entities. The Medes created one of the first Iranian kingdoms, while the Persians settled in Fars and eventually rose to global power under Cyrus the Great. The Achaemenid Empire marked the first great imperial unification of Iran and surrounding regions. Under Cyrus, Darius, and Xerxes, the empire became the largest political structure the world had yet seen. It introduced advanced systems of governance, including satrap provinces, taxation systems, infrastructure networks like the Royal Road, and a model of imperial administration based on tolerance and diversity. The Achaemenid Empire demonstrated that vast and diverse populations could be governed under a structured political system without complete cultural destruction. After the fall of the Achaemenids under Alexander the Great, Iran entered the Hellenistic period. Although Persian political authority collapsed temporarily, Iranian culture persisted beneath Macedonian and Seleucid rule. Over time, Iranian identity re-emerged through the rise of the Parthian Empire. The Parthians restored Iranian political independence and developed a decentralized but resilient system that successfully resisted Roman expansion for centuries. Their military strength, especially their cavalry warfare, became legendary in ancient history. Following the Parthians, the Sassanid Empire re-established centralized Iranian rule and created one of the most sophisticated states of the ancient world. The Sassanids strengthened royal authority, made Zoroastrianism a central element of state ideology, and developed advanced systems of administration, architecture, and military organization. Their long conflict with Rome and later Byzantium shaped the political balance of the Near East for centuries. Despite their strength, the Sassanids eventually declined due to prolonged wars, internal instability, and succession crises. This weakness allowed the rapid expansion of early Islamic forces, leading to the fall of the empire. In the mid-7th century CE, with the death of Yazdegerd III, the final pre-Islamic Iranian imperial structure came to an end. However, the collapse of political power did not mean the collapse of Iranian civilization. Instead, Iran entered a new phase of transformation. Its administrative systems, cultural traditions, language, and intellectual heritage continued to survive and eventually became deeply integrated into the Islamic world. Persian culture, far from disappearing, became one of the most influential forces in shaping Islamic civilization. Across all these periods, a continuous thread can be seen: the persistence of Iranian identity through change, whether under Elamite kings, Achaemenid emperors, Parthian nobles, or Sassanid monarchs. Iran maintained a distinctive cultural and civilizational continuity. Even when empires fell or foreign powers ruled the land, the deeper structures of language, tradition, and memory remained. Iran before Islam is therefore not just a story of empires rising and falling. It is a story of adaptation, resilience, and continuity across more than a millennium of history. It is the story of how a civilization can change its political forms many times while preserving its cultural core. From the earliest settlements to the final fall of the Sassanids, ancient Iran shaped the development of governance, warfare, trade, religion, and intellectual life across the ancient world. Its influence extended far beyond its borders, affecting neighboring civilizations and later world empires. In conclusion, the legacy of ancient Persia is not confined to the past. It continues to live through cultural memory, language, traditions, and historical identity. The empires may have ended, but the civilization itself became part of the foundation of later world history. When the last Sassanid structures collapsed and Iran entered the early Islamic period, the world did not simply witness the disappearance of an ancient civilization. Instead, what occurred was a transformation where old Iranian foundations were absorbed into new global systems and continued shaping them in subtle but powerful ways. One of the most enduring contributions of ancient Iran was the concept of imperial administration as a long-term governing science. The idea that a vast territory could be organized into provinces, governed through structured taxation, written records, and professional bureaucracy, did not vanish with the fall of Persian empires. Instead, it became a model adopted, adapted, and expanded by later Islamic governments. This administrative DNA of ancient Iran became one of its most important hidden legacies. Another major inheritance was political culture. Ancient Iranian kingship was not based only on conquest, but on the idea of justice, order, and legitimacy, rooted in higher moral authority. Even after the end of pre-Islamic dynasties, Persian political thought continued to influence how later societies understood rulership, responsibility, and state legitimacy. The memory of rulers like Cyrus and Darius remained symbolic representations of ideal governance. Geography also ensured continuity. Iran was never an isolated civilization. Its position between East and West meant that, regardless of who ruled politically, it remained a permanent corridor of exchange. Trade routes such as the Silk Road did not disappear with imperial collapse. They adapted. Caravans continued moving goods, ideas, technologies, and cultural practices across Iranian lands, ensuring that the region remained a central artery of Eurasian civilization. Urban continuity is another key legacy. Many ancient Iranian cities did not disappear after conquest. Instead, they evolved. Cities like Isfahan, Rey, Nishapur, and others built upon earlier urban foundations that stretched back to pre-Islamic times. Even when new architectural styles emerged, the spatial logic of cities, markets, administrative centers, and cultural districts reflected long-standing Iranian urban traditions. Language also remained a powerful force of continuity. Although political language changed after the Islamic conquest, the Persian language eventually re-emerged as one of the dominant literary languages of the region. This linguistic revival carried within it echoes of ancient Iranian identity, preserving expressions, concepts, and cultural memory that had survived across centuries of transformation. Religious transformation did not erase older philosophical foundations either. While Zoroastrianism lost its dominant political position, many of its ethical and symbolic concepts continued to influence cultural thinking in indirect ways. Ideas of moral duality, truth versus falsehood, and cosmic justice remained embedded in cultural narratives, literature, and philosophical thought long after institutional religion changed. Perhaps the most important legacy of ancient Iran is continuity through adaptation. Unlike civilizations that disappear entirely after collapse, Iranian civilization repeatedly restructured itself. Elamite foundations evolved into Median organization, which evolved into Achaemenid imperial systems, which were later transformed through Parthian decentralization and Sassanid centralization. Each phase ended politically, but not culturally. This pattern of transformation reveals a deeper truth. Ancient Iran was not a static empire, but a civilizational process. It survived because it was flexible enough to absorb change while maintaining core identity structures. By the time Iran entered the Islamic era, it was no longer an imperial system in the ancient sense, but it was also not a lost civilization. Instead, it had become a foundational layer beneath new political and religious structures, continuing to influence art, governance, scholarship, and cultural identity across a much larger world. In this sense, the story of Iran before Islam does not end with conquest. It continues as legacy, a legacy that shaped not only regional history, but also contributed to the broader development of Eurasian civilization. Even after the political end of pre-Islamic Iran, the deeper story of ancient Persia continued to unfold in the centuries that followed. Not as an empire, but as a cultural foundation that quietly shaped the direction of regional and world history. When new Islamic states expanded across Iran, they did not replace the entire structure of society. Instead, they inherited a land that already had thousands of years of administrative experience, urban development, and cultural sophistication. Because of this, many elements of earlier Iranian civilization were not destroyed, but integrated into the new order. Local governance, taxation practices, and bureaucratic traditions often continued with modifications rather than complete replacement. One of the most significant long-term effects was the rise of Persian influence within Islamic civilization itself. Although Arabic became the language of religion and early state authority, Persian gradually re-emerged as a major cultural and literary force. This was not a revival from nothing, but a continuation of a deeply rooted linguistic tradition that had survived through Middle Persian and earlier forms. Over time, Persian became one of the key languages of science, poetry, philosophy, and administration across the Islamic world. In literature, the memory of ancient Iran remained powerful. Epic traditions preserved stories of pre-Islamic kings, heroes, and moral ideals. These narratives were not simply historical records. They were cultural memory systems that kept the identity of ancient Iran alive within a new civilization. Through storytelling, the ancient world of Persia remained present in the imagination of later generations. In governance, many of the principles associated with earlier Iranian empires continued to influence political thought. The idea of a strong but just ruler responsible for maintaining order and fairness remained an important concept in Persian-influenced political culture. Even when dynasties changed, this ideal of kingship continued to shape expectations of leadership. In science and learning, Iran became one of the major intellectual centers of the medieval world. Scholars of Persian origin played key roles in fields such as mathematics, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, and translation. This intellectual rise was not separate from ancient heritage, but built upon earlier traditions of observation, administration, and cross-cultural exchange that had existed in pre-Islamic Iran for centuries. Cities that had existed long before Islam continued to function as major centers of civilization. Urban continuity ensured that knowledge, trade, and culture were not interrupted but transformed. Markets, caravan routes, and educational institutions adapted to new political realities while maintaining older structural patterns. Even religious and philosophical ideas showed subtle continuity. While belief systems changed, many ethical and symbolic concepts from ancient Iranian thought continued to influence cultural expression. Ideas related to justice, moral struggle, and cosmic order found new interpretations within different religious frameworks, showing how deep cultural patterns can survive transformation. What makes the history of Iran before Islam unique is not only its length, but its resilience. Few civilizations in the ancient world maintained such a continuous identity across so many political transformations, from Elamite city-states to the Achaemenid Empire, from Parthian nobles to Sassanid kings. Iran repeatedly changed its political form without losing its cultural core. This continuity is the defining feature of ancient Iranian history. Empires rose and fell. Capitals changed. Religions evolved. And foreign powers ruled at different times. But the underlying civilization remained present, adapting to each new era. In the final view, the story of Iran before Islam is not simply a closed chapter of history. It is a foundational layer in the broader story of Eurasian civilization. Its influence extends far beyond its chronological boundaries, shaping the development of governance, culture, language, trade, and intellectual life across multiple later civilizations. Ancient Iran did not disappear. It transformed, merged, and continued, leaving behind a legacy that still echoes in the modern world. When examining the full span of Iran before Islam, one of the most important conclusions is that its history is not linear, but layered. Each civilization did not simply replace the previous one. Instead, it absorbed, restructured, and reinterpreted earlier foundations. This is why Iranian history appears as a continuous chain of transformation rather than separate historical breaks. The earliest layer, formed by prehistoric settlements and Elamite civilization, introduced the first concepts of organized society in the region. Governance, early writing systems, irrigation management, and urban life began during this phase. Even though Elam eventually declined as a political power, its presence established Iran as a permanent center of early civilization in the ancient Near East. The next major layer emerged with the Indo-Iranian migrations, which introduced linguistic and cultural elements that would define the identity of later Iranian peoples. From these groups emerged the Medes and Persians, who gradually formed organized states and laid the groundwork for imperial development. This transition marked the shift from regional societies to large-scale political structures. The Achaemenid Empire then created the first truly global Iranian political system. It was not only an empire of conquest, but also an empire of structure. Its innovations in administration, communication, governance, and cultural tolerance allowed it to manage unprecedented diversity. The Achaemenid model became a reference point for later imperial systems across different regions of the world. After its fall, the Hellenistic period introduced external cultural influence, but it did not erase Iranian identity. Instead, it created a transitional phase where Iranian traditions adapted and survived beneath new political forms. This period demonstrated one of the most important patterns in Iranian history: cultural persistence under foreign rule. The Parthian Empire then restored Iranian political independence in a new form. Unlike earlier centralized empires, the Parthians created a decentralized aristocratic system that reflected both Iranian traditions and practical adaptation to regional realities. Their long resistance against Rome showed the durability of Iranian political identity even in a fragmented structure. The Sassanid Empire represented a return to centralized imperial ideology, combining strong monarchy with religious and cultural unification. It refined earlier administrative systems, strengthened state identity, and created one of the most sophisticated pre-modern states in the world. Its intellectual, architectural, and military achievements marked the final peak of pre-Islamic Iranian imperial civilization. When the Sassanid state fell, it did not erase the accumulated layers of Iranian civilization. Instead, those layers were absorbed into a new historical environment. Administrative systems, cultural memory, urban structures, and intellectual traditions continued to function in transformed ways. This reveals a deeper historical truth. Iran before Islam should not be understood as a single era, but as a civilizational continuum. Each empire contributed a different dimension. Elam contributed origins. The Medes contributed political consolidation. The Achaemenids contributed imperial structure. The Parthians contributed resilience and adaptation, and the Sassanids contributed refinement and synthesis. Together, these layers created a civilization that was both stable and flexible, capable of surviving conquest, transformation, and cultural change over thousands of years. Even more importantly, this layered structure explains why Iranian civilization remained influential after the end of its ancient political systems. Because its foundations were deeply embedded in administration, language, urban life, and cultural memory, it could reappear in new forms without losing its identity. In the final analysis, the history of Iran before Islam is not only the story of empires that ended, but the story of a civilization that continuously redefined itself while preserving its core structure. It is a rare example in world history of continuity through transformation on such a large and sustained scale. When the long arc of Iran before Islam is viewed as a single continuum, one final pattern becomes clear. Iranian civilization consistently functioned as a bridge between worlds. It connected East and West, steppe and settled land, nomadic culture and urban administration, local identity, and imperial structure. This bridging role is one of its most defining historical signatures. From its earliest phases, the Iranian plateau was never isolated. Instead, it sat at the intersection of major ancient civilizations: Mesopotamia to the west, Central Asia to the north and east, the Indian subcontinent to the southeast, and later the Mediterranean world through Anatolia. Because of this geography, Iranian civilizations were constantly exposed to exchange, pressure, and adaptation. This interaction shaped a culture that was both resilient and flexible. The Achaemenid Empire formalized this bridging role on a global scale for the first time. It unified diverse regions into a single administrative system while still allowing cultural autonomy. In doing so, it created a model of imperial organization where diversity was not eliminated but structured. This principle became one of the most influential contributions of ancient Iran to world political history. Later, during the Parthian period, Iran again functioned as a central corridor of exchange, especially through the Silk Road. Goods, technologies, religious ideas, and artistic styles moved through Iranian territory continuously. Rather than being a passive route, Iran actively shaped what passed through it, filtering and transforming influences from both east and west. The Sassanid Empire further strengthened this role by establishing Iran as one of the two major political poles of the late ancient world, opposite Byzantium. This dual-system world created a balance of power in which Iran was not peripheral but central to global geopolitics of the time. The constant interaction between these two empires influenced military systems, diplomacy, trade networks, and cultural development across Eurasia. Another defining feature of Iranian civilization was its ability to preserve continuity through institutions rather than uninterrupted political stability. When empires collapsed, institutions such as administration, trade networks, urban centers, and cultural traditions ensured continuity. This institutional memory allowed Iranian civilization to re-emerge repeatedly in new political forms. Equally important was the symbolic continuity of kingship and justice across different dynasties and centuries. The idea of the ruler as a guardian of order remained deeply embedded in political culture. Even when the political structure changed, the expectation of moral governance and structured authority persisted as a cultural ideal. Iran's intellectual legacy also reflects this bridging function. It absorbed and transmitted knowledge between civilizations, translating ideas from Greek philosophy, Indian mathematics, Mesopotamian astronomy, and developing its own interpretive frameworks. This role as a knowledge intermediary became especially important in later centuries, when Persian scholars helped shape intellectual traditions across the broader region. In this way, Iran before Islam was not only a sequence of empires, but a continuous civilizational system that connected multiple worlds. Its strength lay not only in military power or territorial control, but in its ability to integrate diversity into structured systems of governance, culture, and knowledge. The final conclusion of this entire historical arc is that ancient Iran's most enduring achievement was not a single empire or dynasty, but the creation of a durable civilizational framework. This framework survived political collapse, foreign conquest, and religious transformation, continuing to influence later societies long after the ancient empires themselves disappeared. Thus, Iran before Islam stands as one of the most important examples in human history of a civilization that did not simply rise and fall, but evolved continuously across millennia, leaving behind a structural legacy that shaped the development of the wider world. When the full history of Iran before Islam is brought to its deepest level of interpretation, beyond empires, beyond king, and beyond political change, what remains is not only a sequence of events, but a long continuity of meaning shaped across thousands of years. This meaning is rooted in how Iranian civilization repeatedly responded to collapse, conquest, and transformation. In many ancient worlds, the fall of an empire often meant the disappearance of its identity. In Iran, however, collapse rarely meant disappearance. Instead, it meant reconfiguration. Each ending became a foundation for a new beginning, and each rupture became a point of transformation rather than termination. This pattern can be traced from the earliest civilizations of the Iranian plateau to the final moments of the Sassanid Empire. ISIAM ended, but its cultural footprint remained. The Medes disappeared as a political power, but their organizational influence persisted. The Achaemenid Empire fell, but its administrative genius survived in later systems. The Parthians dissolved, but their aristocratic and military traditions continued to influence regional structures. The Sassanids collapsed, but their intellectual and bureaucratic legacy transitioned into the next historical phase. What emerges from this long pattern is a civilization defined not by permanence of political form, but by permanence of cultural structure. The core identity of Iranian civilization was preserved not through static continuity, but through adaptive resilience. Another key dimension of this history is the role of memory. Iranian civilization preserved its past not only through written records, but through cultural transmission, stories, epics, oral traditions, and symbolic representations of kingship and heroism. This cultural memory functioned as a bridge between eras, ensuring that even after major transformations, older identities were not erased but reinterpreted. In this sense, history in ancient Iran was never purely chronological. It was layered, where past and present coexisted within cultural consciousness. Kings of earlier eras continued to live in later imagination, not as distant figures, but as symbolic references for justice, legitimacy, and moral order. The geography of Iran also reinforced this continuity. The plateau's natural structure, mountains, deserts, and valleys, created both separation and connection. It protected internal development while also allowing long-distance interaction through defined corridors. This balance between isolation and connectivity shaped a civilization that was both internally cohesive and externally engaged. Over thousands of years, this environment produced a distinctive civilizational rhythm. Expansion, fragmentation, adaptation, and reformation. Each phase contributed new elements while preserving older foundations beneath the surface. By the end of the Sassanid period, this rhythm had already become deeply established. Even as the political system weakened, the cultural structure remained intact enough to transition into a new era, rather than collapse completely. This is why Iranian civilization continued to play a central role in the centuries that followed. Ultimately, the deepest conclusion of Iran before Islam is not about which empire was strongest or which king was greatest. It is about the endurance of a civilizational system that survived through transformation. It is about how identity can persist without fixed political form, how culture can outlast power, and how meaning can continue even after structure changes. Ancient Iran therefore represents one of the most profound examples in world history of continuity through change. Its legacy is not confined to ruins, inscriptions, or empires that no longer exist. Its legacy is the idea that civilization itself can evolve without disappearing. This is the final layer of the story. Not the end of Iran, but the end of one form of Iran that continued to live in another. When all layers of Iran before Islam are viewed together, political, cultural, intellectual, and symbolic, the final understanding moves beyond history itself. It becomes a study of how a civilization continues to exist in transformed states long after its original forms have disappeared. Ancient Iran does not remain only in the past because it was never confined to a single political identity. Its history is defined by continuity across discontinuity. Each empire, each dynasty, and each collapse contributed to a larger civilizational process that extended far beyond any single era. The early civilizations established the foundation. The classical empires built structure and scale. The imperial systems refined governance and culture. And the final transition into the post-Sassanid world did not erase these layers but carried them forward into new historical conditions. What makes this case unique in world history is not simply its longevity, but its adaptability. Iranian civilization consistently transformed external pressures into internal evolution. Conquest did not fully erase identity. Instead, it often reshaped it. Political collapse did not end continuity, it redirected it. Cultural interaction did not dilute identity, it expanded its expression. Across this entire timeline, one pattern remains constant. Iran as a civilization functioned as both a receiver and a transmitter of influence. It absorbed ideas from surrounding regions, refined them, and reintroduced them into broader Eurasian networks in transformed forms. This dynamic position ensured its continuous relevance across different historical systems. Even after the fall of the ancient imperial world, the structural memory of Iran remained embedded in institutions, language, literature, and cultural imagination. This memory was not static. It evolved, merged, and re-emerged across new contexts, demonstrating the civilization is not only built on power, but also on continuity of thought and identity. In the deepest sense, the history of Iran before Islam is not a closed chapter. It is a foundational layer of a much longer civilizational narrative that extends into later periods. The ancient world does not end abruptly. It transitions, carrying its foundations forward into new cultural and political realities. Thus, the ultimate conclusion of this entire series is that Iran before Islam represents not a finished past, but a continuing presence in historical development. It shows how civilizations do not simply disappear, they transform, persist, and reappear in new forms across time. This is the final reflection. History is not only about what ended, but about what continued beyond ending. At the end of every long civilization, there is a moment where history stops being a sequence of empires and becomes a single continuous memory. The history of Iran before Islam reaches that point, when all earlier layers, Elamite beginnings, Median formation, Achaemenid Empire, Hellenistic transition, Parthian resilience, and Sassanid culmination are seen not as separate stories, but as one uninterrupted civilizational arc. What began in early settlements on the Iranian plateau slowly evolved into one of the most influential cultural and political systems of the ancient world. Over thousands of years, Iran developed a pattern of civilization built on endurance, adaptation, and renewal. It repeatedly faced invasion, fragmentation, and transformation, yet each time it re-emerged in a new form, carrying forward its historical core. The ancient Iranian world was defined by this rhythm of continuity. Empires rose and fell, but governance traditions remained. Languages changed and evolved, but cultural identity persisted. Religions transformed, but ethical and symbolic frameworks continued to influence society. Even when political sovereignty disappeared, civilizational memory remained active beneath new systems. The final fall of the Sassanid Empire in the 7th century CE marked the end of pre-Islamic imperial Iran, but it did not mark the end of Iranian civilization itself. Instead, it marked the transition from an imperial phase to a cultural phase. The structures of the ancient world dissolved, but their foundations were absorbed into the next historical order. This transition is what makes Iran unique in ancient history. It does not end abruptly like a collapsed system. It transforms gradually like a continuing process. Its identity is not tied to one empire, one religion, or one political form, but to a long-standing civilizational continuity that survives through change. From the perspective of world history, ancient Iran represents one of the earliest and most sophisticated examples of large-scale civilization management. It developed systems of administration, communication, law, urban planning, military organization, and cultural integration that influenced later civilizations across Eurasia. But beyond systems and structures, its most important legacy is conceptual, the idea that civilization can endure through transformation. That identity is not dependent on permanence of political form. That history is not a straight line of rise and fall, but a layered process of continuity beneath change. In this final view, Iran before Islam is not only an ancient subject of study, it is a reminder of how civilizations survive. It shows that even when empires disappear, the deeper architecture of culture, memory, and knowledge can continue to live in new forms, shaping future worlds in ways that are often invisible but deeply enduring. And so the ancient world of Iran does not truly end here. It ends only as a political era, but continues as a civilizational presence that moves forward into later history, carrying its legacy into the shaping of new ages.